Good evening. Welcome to the Maison Française. I'm pleased to see so many of you here. We are welcoming you to this Eugene Sheffer Distinguished Lecture by Philippe Descola on Cosmopolitics of the Anthropocene. Philippe Descola is Professor Emeritus at the Collège de France, where he created and held the Anthropology of Nature chair from 2000 to 2019. He also headed the Social Anthropology Laboratory, which is a joint laboratory between the Collège de France and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and the CNRS. He directed studies at the École des Hautes Études, where he taught a weekly seminar on the comparative anthropology of relations between humans and non-humans. Philippe is one of the world's leading anthropologists. He began his research career by carrying out an ethnographic survey among the Ashwar Jivaros, am I pronouncing that correctly? Approximately, okay, of the Ecuadorian Amazon for 3 years in the late 1970s, and focused in particular on the relationship of these people with their environment, which became the subject of his doctoral thesis that he did with Claude Lévi-Strauss. But this early fieldwork led him to question the duality that was taken for granted by anthropologists at the time and by other social sciences, that is, the very concept of a division between culture on one hand and society on the other hand, or nature on the other hand. And this supposed duality didn't adequately capture the diversity of ways human groups understand the relationship between humans and non-humans, and more broadly, their diverse ways of inhabiting the world. So Professor Descola developed an alternative approach to anthropology, the anthropology of nature, that is really a revolution in the human sciences and challenges our ways of thinking about the climate emergency and ecological devastation that we're currently facing, and invites us to envision a less destructive and a less anthropocentric relationship with the earth, a cosmopolitics of the Anthropocene. I'll just name a few of his many books. They include Claude Lévi-Strauss, Un parcours dans le siècle, Par la nature et culture, which was translated into English as Beyond Nature and Culture, La fabrique des images, Vision du monde et forme de la représentation, L'écologie des autres, La composition des mondes, and other books that I won't give the full list because it would take a very long time. The newest English translation of his work, which is just coming out this month, is Forms of the Visible, an Anthropology of Figuration, which he will be discussing tomorrow at Villa Albertine. And he's currently at work on a book about the anthropology of landscape entitled What is a Landscape? Professor Descola's lecture will be followed by some brief remarks by Hannah Chazen, who is an assistant professor in Columbia's Department of Anthropology, and her research interests include new archaeological interpretations of the relations between humans and animals. Her remarks will be followed by a Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Professor Descola.
Thank you, Shani, for inviting me to speak in Columbia. It's my first time in Columbia, although I've given talks before in New York, but never in Columbia. So it's a first experience. The new climate regime we have entered, sometime referred to as Anthropocene, has made painfully clear the inadequacy of the words we use to describe the realities that surround us or that we aspire to understand. How can we describe a natural phenomenon, something as a natural phenomenon, something, the climate, whose anthropogenic dimensions we are increasingly able to measure? Conversely, How can we continue to talk about the environment, meaning what surrounds humans, when the science of ecosystems teaches us that interactions between organisms and their milieu must be understood from a systemic perspective and not as the mere surroundings of a single species, however disruptive it may be. However, this increasingly obvious mismatch between words and reality is a phenomenon that anthropologists have long experienced, since the key concepts of the social sciences that they are led to use as a common language prove to be very unfaithful to the realities they are supposed to describe as soon as they encounter worlds that are very different from their own. Key concepts in the social sciences, terms such as culture, nature, society, history, economy, politics, religion, and art, have certainly helped to shed light on the collective condition of Europeans and to put words to phenomena that were gaining a perceptible autonomy between the early 18th and late 19th centuries. This was a crucial period during which the main concepts that enable Europe to define itself reflexively as a collective rooted in a historical process were forged. And yet, because of their origins, these concepts are anything but transhistorical. On the contrary, they are the result of a very unique social and cultural history. Intrinsically linked to the socio-political destiny of modern Europe, its emancipation from the societies of the Ancien Régime and its entry into mercantile and then industrial capitalism, these concepts have nevertheless been reused by the social sciences to describe and explain non-European societies as if their descriptive validity were universal. However, this quiet conviction that European societies could serve as a benchmark for qualifying all forms of association is in fact linked to the evolutionary ideology that dominated the formative period of the social sciences, which saw all human groups as destined to go through the same stages in order to perhaps one day, and with the help of colonization, to become societies similar to those found in Europe, with the same kind of institutions and the same kind of division between economic, political, and ideological bodies. In the meantime, they were only imperfect precursors in which ethnologists struggled to discern the still blurred form of their future realization as complete societies similar to our own. But this Eurocentrism of social science concepts that have now entered common usage, not only makes them inadequate for describing realities different from those familiar to Westerners or even to modern people in the broad sense, this Eurocentrism also makes them unsuitable for grasping the state of the world we have entered with the new climatic regime, a state characterized by increasing porous boundaries between the human and non-human worlds. Earth's gravitational pull, the chemical formula of water, or photosynthesis describe objects and phenomena whose principles of composition and functioning are identical everywhere on our planet. The same cannot be said of concepts such as society, culture, or nature, which carve up the fabric of the world according to organizing schemes that are specific to a single part of the world and a certain era. In short, they are perfectly relative while falsely claiming to be universal. This is why I've felt the necessity to take the discussion further, going beyond criticism of this or that concept in the sociological repertoire and returning to a deeper level of elaboration of the common world. In this case, at the level of detecting regularities in the world, which, when systematized, have the effect of producing forms of collective, conceptions of the subject, theories of action, epistemic modes, and conceptions of time and space that are specific to broad social universes. Proceeding in this way, I no longer consider, as is customary in the social sciences, societies as already constituted realities, that is, as assemblages of humans who have given themselves conventions, but rather seek to understand how singular collectives emerge, only some of which think of themselves as societies, those that developed in Europe from the 18th century onward and then spread to many parts of the world, but not all parts of the world, with colonization and the globalization of trade. So this can be called an ontological detour. It is not a thesis about what the world is, but an investigation into how humans detect certain characteristics of objects in order to turn them into worlds. It is because these primary modes of identifying worlds vary that the forms of collective that humans will imagine may also differ. Humans will be immersed in political configurations, types of exchange, and kinds of relationship between themselves and with non-humans that vary widely and change over time. My ambition is therefore to bring the critical aim of the social sciences down to a very basic level, to make them better able to grasp the general form of interactions between beings. From this point of view, moreover, it is no longer just a question of social sciences, that is, those sciences concerning exclusively integrated groups of humans, since within these very diverse assemblages, the interactions to be studied and understood take place between agents with very diverse ontological statuses. Humans, of course, but also organisms, artifacts, representations, affordances and physical effects, deities, images, and many other elements. The science to be constructed would be more a general science of relations, an ecology in the broad sense, a science yet to come, to which all disciplines would contribute that are concerned with what might be called interagency. Interagency, that is the process that gives rise to emerging properties as a result of the interaction between human and non-human agents possessing different qualities but capable of affecting each other. Until such a science exists, and I have no idea whether it will exist one day, I'm trying to make it happen. But until such a science exists, I try to do this as an anthropologist, but with one fundamental requirement, namely to situate anthropological analysis at a more elementary level than it has operated at until now. I think that we cannot explain the system of differences in the specifically human way of inhabiting the world by considering these differences as the derivative product of this or that type of institution, economic organization, technical infrastructure, value system, worldview, etc. In short, all those aspects of collectives that are hypostasized by the social sciences in order to highlight determinations. On the contrary, all these aspects are the stabilized results of more fundamental intuitions about what the world contains and about the relations between its human and non-human components. So the word ontology, which I started using at the end of the 1990s, seemed to me to be appropriate to designate this analytical level, which could be described as antipredicative in the language of phenomenology, Husserlian phenomenology, but which, in a sense, signals a requirement for conceptual hygiene. The roots of human diversity must be sought at a deeper level, that of the differences in the basic inferences humans make depending on the situations about the kinds of beings that populate the world and the ways in which these beings relate to each other. From this arise the types of collectives within which life unfolds and the nature of their composition. From this arise the forms of subjectivation and objectivation. From this arise the regimes of temporality and the forms of figuration. From this arise, in fact, all the richness of social and cultural life. What consequences might this kind of reformulation have on the way we conceive of a new cosmopolitics, that is, a system of joint accommodation between being and things that attempts to escape the Eurocentrism of the categories through which we conceive of dual relations to land, to physical objects, and to non-human organisms. The first consequence is a mere observation. The main difference between extra-modern cosmopolitics and modern political institutions is that the former are able to integrate non-humans into collectives, or to see non-humans as political subjects acting within their own collectives, while the latter, modern political institutions, confine non-humans to a function of entourage, resource, or support for symbolic activity. In other words, the kinds of beings that result from extra-modern cosmopolitics are not those with whom we, as moderns, usually form social bonds, accustomed that we are, as we are, to living in collectives composed exclusively of human beings. On the contrary, there are associations of humans and non-humans that can take extremely different forms. For example, if we look closely at the components of what ethnologists call a kinship group, this is something you learn in your first year when you study anthropology, a clan, a lineage, for example, not defined or as defined by anthropology, namely a group of humans descended from a common ancestor, but as conceived by a people where such units exist, we see that these kinship groups contain much more than humans. I will give just two examples. Among the Wodabe Fulani of the Sahel, the term Doudal is usually used, or was usually used by ethnologists to refer to a fraction of a lineage, namely the largest segmentary unit functioning as a corporate group. However, as the anthropologist Angelo Bonfiglioli has shown, Doudal refers both to a line of humans and to a line of zebu cattle that the former have selected over generations. So a group of humans, the Doudal lineage, and a group of domestic animals, the Doudal herd, thus form a continuous and intertwined whole designated by the same term. The same can be said of a concept used by the Tuva pastoralists of Siberia. The term is Al-Kodan, whose meaning is even broader than that of Doudal. Charles Stepanov, who studied the Tuva, explains that Al-Kodan refers to a camp, its human occupants, its dogs and its herd, its yurts, its enclosures, and the pastures that surround it, so that humans, non-humans, and the land are inextricably incorporated into that notion. The solidarity of all members of this ontologically hybrid community or collective, hybrid at least for us, not of course for the Tuva, becomes evident in times of crisis when the herd is affected by an episodic disease. Humans suffer from nightmares, a sign that the Al-Kodan as a whole is under attack from malevolent spirits. As a result, the entire Al-Kodan must be treated by a shaman. Similar notions denoting under the same term a local human group, its habitat site, their herds, and their grazing areas are used by the Sami of Norway, the Events of Yakutia, or by the Mongols, and probably there's a much wider distribution, but these are only the cases that I became aware of. The case of what in the Andes is called an Ailu is even more striking and shows that this kind of terminological encompassment is not restricted to nomadic pastoralists. In ethnographic literature, the Quechua term Ailu is traditionally defined as a kinship group, a lineage, or an indigenous community with a territorial base that engages in common activities, notably ritual activities. However, when we look closely at the ethnography of Andean communities, it is clear that an Ailu is much more than a human group. It also includes plants animals, local spirits, and much more. Let us listen to what Justo Ocha, one of Marisol de la Cadena's collaborators in the Cusco region, has to say on the subject. I quote, "Ayllu is like a weaving, and all the beings in the world, people, animals, mountains, plants, etc., are like the threads. We are part of the design. The beings in this world are not alone, just as a thread by itself is not a weaving, and weaving are with threads, a runa, that is a Quechua-speaking person, is always in Ayllu with other beings. That is Ayllu. In other words, in the clan, the lineage, the totemic group, or the Ayllu, there is always much more than living and dead men, women, and children. There are also animals, plants, territories, deities, spirits, sanctuaries, pathogens, knowledge and skills, and 1,000 other things necessary for life. And these components are present from the outset. They are constitutive of the mixed unity formed by these segments and are not added after the fact as a suggestive backdrop for the theater of human actions or as mere providers of metaphors to better express the sociality of these actions as the social sciences tend to treat them. So the idea that the unit of analysis in anthropology is provided solely by humans is thus an obstacle that has obscured the understanding of the specifically political dimensions of collective life outside modern societies. There were certainly reasons for that, and even good reasons. The anthropocentrism of modernity has its philosophical roots in the struggle against the organic order of the Ancien Régime, accompanied by the development of individualism as the foundation of all legitimacy. This resulted in the promotion of institutions and ways of life that were in stark contrast to pre-revolutionary assemblages. What happened, in fact, in terms of the reconfiguration of relations between humans and non-humans between the end of the 16th century and the 19th century, first in England, then in the rest of Europe and in the United States? The hierarchical segments of collective with statutory orders broke down, liberating a huge crowd of human individuals who were equals in rights, but still separated by concrete disparities, both within the particular communities to which they belonged and within the formal aggregate that these communities together constituted in the so-called concert of nations. The mixed cosmos that each collective had carved out for itself, diluted into an infinite universe, gradually recognized as such by all those who, regardless of their position on the surface of the earth, accept the universality of the non-human immanent laws that govern it. Above all, the city of God fragmented into a multitude of so-called societies from which non-humans were banished in law, if not always in fact, thus giving rise to collectives of the same nature and therefore comparable, although long considered these collectives unequal among themselves on an evolutionary scale, due in particular to the apparent inability of some of these collectives to expel from the heart of their social life the non-humans of all kinds that had been accommodated there. In short, the invention of modern collectives involved a radical purge. Non-humans were expelled from the city, leaving only humans, the sole subject of law. And the representation that moderns gave themselves of their form of political aggregation were then transposed to the analysis of extra-modern societies, along with a host of specificities, such as the division between nature and culture, between belief and knowledge, between fact and value, or more simply, the idea that a clan, a lineage, or an ilu contains only humans. It is this Eurocentric and anthropocentric conception of politics that we must break with. To do this, particularly when looking at people's relationship with the places they live, we need to let go of a lot of preconceptions. That is, realize that the concepts we usually use to describe extra-modern groups actually describe situations that are mostly characteristics of modern societies. I will take two examples. The first concerns the idea of appropriation in general, and more specifically, the appropriation of territory. This is a concept that, regardless of the historical context, has been widely used by historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists to describe the relationship between a group of humans and the place it inhabits, even though it is largely the product of a legal and philosophical system specific to the West. Since the beginning of the enclosure movement in England, Europe first, then other parts of the world in its wake, have continued to transform an ever-increasing part of the living environment into alienable and privately appropriable commodities, a movement of commodification that is by no means universal and was made possible in part by a conception of appropriation as the act by which an individual or a community becomes the holder of a right to a component of the world, a conception that is closely linked to modern political philosophy as developed in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in England, with the theory of possessive individualism at the forefront. However, this configuration makes little sense to qualify the relation to the land of many extra-modern collectives, if only because in many of them, and particularly in non-European kingdoms, the sovereign's power is over the control of humans or cosmic fertility, not directly over the land, which is beyond his control. But it is also the very notion of territory that must be questioned, because in an extra-modern context, a territory rarely corresponds to what we have come to understand by this term since the emergence of the Westphalian system in Europe, namely a portion of space over which a state exercises sovereignty and whose stable boundaries are recognized, more or less, by neighboring states. For example, anthropology and history have shown that it is common for the same physical space to be used as territory by different human groups. This is the case when farmers, hunter-gatherers, or nomadic pastoralists share different resources in the same milieu. And there are countless examples of that in Africa, South America, and Asia. It is also common for a human collective to use different sites that constitute a discontinuous territory, sometimes sharing portions of it with other human collectives. A well-known case is the so-called vertical archipelago in the Andes, a system that dates back to before the Inca period and has been maintained to this day in areas where the Quechua and Aymara languages are spoken, and whereby a community established in a central area where it grows potatoes and corn, maintains outlying settlements both in the highlands, which are reserved for llama breeding, and in the lowlands, where tropical species are cultivated. Furthermore, the use of land is not controlled solely by humans. It also depends on a host of non-humans that seem to have the power to act autonomously. Deities, spirits, genies, ancestors, ghosts, plants, animals, elements of the landscape, meteors, and with whom humans must coexist, or upon whom they depend. I have used the term collective several times. Unlike other categories referring to organized groups of beings, notably the concept of society, the concept of collective has the immense merit of not prejudging in any way the content of what it is associated, nor the modes of assembly. With the notion of collective, the ontological dissociation between associations of humans, society, nation, community, lineage, tribe, class, etc., and groupings of non-humans, species, herds, bands, technical lineages, pantheons, collections, etc., this dissociation no longer has any place. This is not to say, of course, that all forms of associations are identical, quite the contrary, but their typology is no longer, or should no longer be based on the fundamental distinction between humans and non-humans that underpins the modern system. So how can we define a collective? I borrowed the notion initially from Bruno Latour, but my use of it differs from his. For Latour, the collective is the product of a literal action of collecting, by means of which various types of force and beings are associated. It is thus a process, even a project, indissociable from the actor network theory, of which it constitutes one of the principal tools, and which consists in assembling heterogeneous entities not yet united in order to test the relevance of their assembly. So the enterprise is experimental and aims at connecting associations of humans and other than humans who are not separated a priori by the great divide between the domain of nature and that of society. So the Latourian collective thus designates a dynamic, at the same time epistemic, metaphysical, and political, a dynamic of the progressive composition of a common world which ignores the two usual attractors of modernity. As a result, no initial specification is required as to the beings that integrate the collective and as to the relations that unite them. Ultimately, the collective, for Latour, is what justifies the work of investigation because its nature and composition are never known in advance. So the Latourian collective is not a substantive object or even a principle of composition, but a procedure aiming at reproducing in an analysis the very movement of recruitment of the sets of humans and non-humans that the analysts have given themselves as objects of study and the citizens as matter of experimentation. Sets that, if everything goes well, could become new forms of political existence, that is to say, expand to other human and non-human agents. I insist that we must acknowledge the great relevance of a notion as it was forged by Bruno Latour, that accounts for real assemblages of beings without making any ontological discrimination within them. It seems to me, however, that to reduce the collective to the sole process of collecting undertaken by the moderns in order to overcome their divided condition is to deprive ourselves of all that the extra-moderns can teach us in this matter. For it is hardly surprising for anthropologists to consider that humans and other than humans are associated in totalities governed by unitary principles, or that mixed groups of humans and other than humans cooperate in all aspects of social life while remaining ontologically different from each other. These kinds of collectives are the usual forms under which extra-moderns have presented themselves to us in all the imaginative diversity of their institutions. As I understand it, a collective is thus a stable form of association between beings that may be ontologically homogeneous or heterogeneous, and whose principles of compositions and modes of relationship between the components are specifiable and can be addressed reflexively by the human members of these assemblages, particularly when it comes to qualifying relationships with neighboring collectives where these principles and modes do not apply. We can therefore envisage that humans and non-humans are associated in totalities governed by unitary principles. This corresponds to the examples I gave earlier of the Fulani Dudal, the Andean Ayllu, and the Tuva camp. We can also consider that monospecific assemblages of humans interact with monospecific assemblages of non-humans according to identical rules of sociability. This is the case with the collectives I have called animist, in Amazonia, for example, or in some parts of Southeast Asia. These types of assemblages are nothing new to anthropologists. They are the usual forms in which extra-modern societies present themselves to us in all the imaginative diversity of their institutions. Collectives thus exist in stable, even canonical forms, which social and political anthropology has certainly described in fragmentary and anthropocentric, in a fragmentary and anthropocentric way, but which it is not impossible to reconstruct in all the richness and complexity of their architecture. Moreover, these stable forms of collective were not invented by a few clear-sighted scholars to provide analytical templates for their colleagues. Their principles of compositions are quite explicit to the humans who are members of them and who are well aware of their merits in relation to those of neighboring collectives, so that it would be absurd and condescending to reserve the comparative anthropology of collectives solely for scholars who have managed to extricate themselves from the front lines of modernization. Furthermore, a collective is not homologous to the usual sociological categories designating associations, to which a few non-humans would be added out of a laudable desire for completeness, a society plus its nature, an ethnic group plus its ancestors, a civilization plus its deities, a socio-professional category plus the tools and materials it uses. It is difficult to see what gain in intelligibility would be achieved in this case, since non-humans would continue to be an embellishment added to an anthropocentric block. This is why I have made the hypothesis that the principles of composition of a collective, that is what determines the nature of the beings it associates, and the possible links that they can maintain, these principles ultimately depend on what I have called modes of identification. I will briefly recall what I mean by that. The general idea is that we must consider the apparent diversity of cultural habits as the product of differentiated processes of worlding, that is, ways of actualizing the multitude of qualities, phenomena, beings, and relations that can be objectified by humans through the ontological filters they use to discriminate between everything their environment offers to their apprehension. I have called these ontological filters that structure worlding modes of identification, borrowing from Marcel Mauss's idea that, I quote him, man identifies himself with things and identifies things with himself by having a sense of both the difference and similarities he establishes. So these modes of identification should be seen as cognitive and sensory motor schemas incorporated and developed during socialization in a particular physical and social milieu, which function as devices for schematizing our practices, intuitions, and perceptions without necessarily, and most of the time, without mobilizing discursive knowledge. In other words, it is this kind of mechanism that allows us to recognize certain things as meaningful and ignore others, to string together sequences of actions without having to think about them, to interpret events and statements in a certain way, and to channel our inferences about the properties of objects in our environment. However, and despite the diversity of qualities that can be detected in beings and things, or inferred from clues provided by their appearance and behavior, it is plausible to think that the ways in which these qualities are organized are not very numerous. Our judgments of identity, that is, the recognition of similarities between objects or events, cannot depend on analytical comparisons carried out term by term. For reasons of cognitive economy, they must be able to operate quickly and unconsciously by induction from shared schemas that are devices for structuring perceived qualities and organizing behavior. And so, based on a fairly simple thought experiment, I therefore made the hypothesis that there were no more than 4 modes of identification. That is, 4 modes, 4 ways of systematizing ontological inferences, each based on the kinds of similarities and differences that humans detect between themselves and non-humans on 2 levels, physical and moral. Indeed, when faced with any other being, human or non-human, I can assume either that it possesses elements of physicality and interiority identical to my own, which I have called totemism, or that their interiority and physicality are distinct from mine, which I have called analogism, or that we have similar interiorities and heterogeneous physicalities, which I have called animism, or finally, that our interiorities are different and our physicalities analogous, which I have called naturalism, and which is in fact the mode of identification that was invented or installed in Europe in the 17th century and under the regime of which we are still functioning right now. I will not go back over the details of these modes of identification, the characteristics of which I've described in several of my books. What has been most important to me in recent years is to test the relevance of these schemes by examining their analytical purchase in accounting for structural variations in very diverse fields of practice and representation. How, for example, do animism, totemism, naturalism, and analogism establish themselves in ontologies that privilege one or another of these modes as the organizing principle of the regime of existence, not existence, but existence, existing beings, and how each of these ontologies in turn prefigures a type of collective that is particularly suited to bringing together the types of beings it distinguishes in a common project and to the complementary expression of their properties in practical life. So the approach, as you see, is frankly ontological, contrary to the most common approach in the social sciences. It is not the dominant categories of social life that serve as a template for thinking about the world. According to Durkheim's famous formula, religion is society transfigured. But rather, the organizing principles of cosmologies, the nature of the beings that populate them, and the relation they are free to weave between themselves, which define the unique form taken by these exclusive assemblages of humans that we call societies. Societies are thus the assemblages that modern sociology has carved out of the fabric of the world to make them the model of all collective existence, because they were more visible than others due to the fact that they are precisely defined in a reflexive way by what they exclude, traditionally called nature. It seemed preferable to me to admit that it is more elementary principles, how analytically prior to social categories, that give rise to the assemblages of humans and non-humans that I call collectives, and that condition the characteristics of the latter. In short, it is the ontological and cosmological level that determines and explains the sociological level, not the other way around. So now, how can we imagine new cosmopolitics from this perspective? Firstly, by reconceptualizing what we consider to be a common good. That is, by extending the scope of what this means for far beyond the usual objects, air, water, wild plants, etc., to include climate, biodiversity, the atmosphere, knowledge, health, linguistic diversity, unpolluted environments, etc. This obviously involves overturning the usual notion of appropriation as the act by which an individual or a collective becomes the holder of a right of use and abuse over a component of the world, and to consider a system in which it is rather ecosystems or systems of interaction between humans and non-humans that are the bearers of rights, with humans as mere usufructuaries or, under certain conditions, guarantors. In such a case, appropriation would flow from the environment to humans and not the other way around. Such a revolution, for that is what it would be, would have to lead to a change in the mechanisms of representation. By this I mean the delegation of responsibilities, of free will, allowing agents involved in collectives of humans and non-humans to assert their point of view through an intermediary, in most cases, in the deliberation of common affairs. This power of representation, due in particular to the distinction between things and person inherited from Roman law, is currently granted only to humans. However, in the spirit of what has just been said about appropriation, it seems essential that as many agents as possible contributing to collective life should see their situation represented, not as individuals endowed as such with interesting rights, whether these individuals be humans, multinationals, or chimpanzees, but as associations of beings in specific milieux, whatever the nature of this milieu: watershed, mountain ranges, cities, coastlines, neighborhoods, ecologically sensitive areas, etc., etc. So a true political ecology, a fully fledged cosmopolitics, would not be content with conferring intrinsic rights on nature without giving nature real means to exercise these rights, it would strive to ensure that unique milieus and everything that compose them, including humans, become political subjects of which humans are the representatives. And this would give a concrete political expression to what I have called the relative universal, namely, beyond the pun, the idea that systems of relations, rather than qualities attached to beings, should form the basis of a new universalisms of values. In their role as representatives, humans would no longer be the source of the right legitimizing the appropriation of nature. They would be the highly diverse representatives of a multitude of natures from which they would have become legally inseparable. It should be noted that such a conception is only strange at first glance in view of the individualistic foundations of our present legal and political system. Ethnology and history offer us many examples of collectives in which the status of humans is derived not from universal capacities deemed universally attached to the person, but from their belonging to a singular collective that indissolubly mixes territories, plants, mountains, animals, sites, deities, and a host of other things, all in constant interactions. In such systems, humans do not possess nature. They are in a way possessed by it, or as the inhabitants of the ZAD, which is an acronym for Zone à défendre, or Zone to Defend, in Notre-Dame-des-Landes in Western France, we do not defend nature, we are nature defending itself. What makes me think that these proposals are not completely utopian? Well, first of all, experiences such as the ZAD and many other cases of human collectives around the world that are demanding rights and sometimes obtaining them, not only for themselves to protect a resource or territory to which they claim exclusive use, but because they wish to protect a unique relationship between humans and non-humans unfolding in a unique milieu. I will give just one example, but a very significant one, that of Sarayaku, an Amerindian community in the Ecuadorian Amazon, threatened with territorial dispossession by oil exploration. In a document presented by members of this community at the COP21 in 2015, they called for national and international recognition of the territory they share with a host of other beings as a new legal category of protected area under the generic name of Causac Sacha, which means living forest in Quechua. And they defined it as follows, I quote, Causac Sacha means that the forest is entirely composed of living beings and the relationship of communication that these beings maintain. All these beings, from the smallest plants to the protective spirits of the forest, are persons. The word they use is runa, a human person, who live in community and develop their existence in a manner analogous to that of humans. That is why the objective is not only to preserve the territories of the First Nations, but also the material and spiritual relationship that these nations weave with the other beings that inhabit the living forest. It is therefore not here a question of granting rights to nature in general, since nature is a pure abstraction, or to plants and animals that will be seen as a kind of human ward. Or it is not even a question of protecting a space because of the physical resources it contains, whether biodiversity or natural objects that can be transformed into commodities. Here, the political subject holder of rights is neither humans nor non-humans, but the unique relationship they form with each other. Another reason for hope is that states have begun to recognize rights not for human communities, but for ecological entities, which thus become legal and political subjects, legal persons capable of asserting their views through human representatives, whose milieu is constituted by these ecological entities. I will go rapidly over these cases because I suppose they are known. But perhaps the first case historically is an act of the New Zealand Parliament in March 2017, by which the Wanganui, which is the country's longest navigable river, became the first watercourse in the world to be granted the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person. This was the original outcome of a very long dispute that began in the second half of the 19th century, when the fishing rights of the Maori tribes along the river were challenged by the government. So the 2017 Act confers legal personality on a single entity called Te Awa Tupua, comprising the river, its ecosystem, its watershed, if you wish, and the Maori living on its banks. It is referred to in section 12 of the Act as, I quote, an indivisible and living whole comprising the Wanganui River from the mountains to the sea, incorporating all its physical and metaphysical elements. Must be the first time in such a legal act that metaphysical elements have been mentioned in modern times. The law also establishes a body called Te Pu Tupua, which is the human personification of this cosmopolitical entity, which exercises the prerogative of landowner on its behalf. And the body comprises two human persons, a representative of the Crown and a representative of the Maori of the river, who have full discretion to intervene on behalf of the Te Awa Tupua. So there were other cases in New Zealand, forests, a mountain, a volcano, Mount Taranaki, in Colombia with the Rio Trato, in Quebec with the Magpie River, and even in Europe with the Mar Menor in the Murcia region of Spain, which is the Mar Menor, the largest saltwater lagoon in Europe, which was given a legal personality in September 2022. I want to emphasize that these legal provisions are very different from the rights granted in the Andean countries to nature, also translated as Mother Earth, Madre Tierra, or Pachamama, for instance, in the Constitution of Ecuador in 2008, or in that of Bolivia the year after. Firstly, because although nature is legally guaranteed in these countries, This does not make it a legal subject. Unlike the Wanganui River, which can take legal action through its representatives, nature, or Pachamama, in Ecuador and Bolivia, can only be defended through an actio popularis, that is, a criminal action brought by a citizen in the interest of public order and the common good. Furthermore, even hypostasized as Mother Earth or Pachamama, nature remains a philosophical abstraction, and a modern one, whose concrete existence and boundaries are difficult to define legally, in contrast to a milieu, which is a biophysical system whose components and boundaries are defined by law. As a result, the legal recognition of nature in Ecuador and Bolivia has produced only limited results, practically, and has not curbed environmental degradation or the development of extractive industries in these countries. Making a living environment a fully fledged subject of law means erasing several centuries of human exceptionalism. It means going against a modern concept of appropriation that makes the isolated human individual the source of all legitimacy and value. It means admitting that human beings are not alone, but that they develop their existence in a Lebenswelt teeming with co-subjects with very diverse characteristics, but all co-constituting our respective identities. Giving legal personality to the Wanganui River is not the same as giving rights to nature, since humans are an integral part of this living environment. It means recognizing that humans and non-humans, when they are codependent within the same milieu, cannot be legally separated because they form a single entity that is both physical and metaphysical, as New Zealand law puts it. And lawyers advocating for the rights of ecosystems have shown that existing legal systems are flexible enough to allow very diverse milieux to become subjects of law, thereby disrupting the meaning of our relationship with the earth and reversing the rights and responsibilities that derive from it. Ultimately, what anthropologists and historians show is that utopia can very well change sides, as they provide evidence that all the ways of inhabiting and subsisting in the world are possible, since some of them, however improbable they may seem, have been explored elsewhere or in the past. The future is therefore not a simple linear extension of the present. It is full of unheard of possibilities that we must imagine in order to build a true common home as soon as possible before the old one collapses under the effect of the casual devastation to which some humans, not all humans, but some humans, have subjected it. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to begin by thanking Shani Pure for organizing this lovely event and to thank as well Professor Descola for his remarks. So his lecture today addresses one of the key challenges of contemporary life: how to confront anthropogenic climate change and to collectively imagine ways to redress the ongoing and future harms to humans and non-humans alike. Rethinking the foundations of anthropology, he argues, offers one path towards the possibility of a different kind of world building. Anthropology and other social sciences should be turned upside down. Rather than seeing the cosmological and ontological coordinates of the extra-moderns as something that emerges from the features of social organizations studied by generations of anthropologists, he argues that it is the ontological and cosmological that determines and explains the sociological. That is to say, the features of what have been commonly referred to as society are actually structured in a fundamental way by what he called modes of identification, these ontological filters that shape human perception and action in the world. These modes of identification, in turn, help to account for differences in the organization of collectives, groups of humans and non-humans across space and time. As an analytical category, collectives are meant to address the exclusion of non-humans from the social and the political, while avoiding this problematic reduction of their presence to mere representation, to scenery for human actions and concerns, or the merely additive extension, society plus nature, a kin group plus its ancestors, a scientific research group plus its laboratory apparatus. I think some of the key features of this argument emerge from a comparison with another approach that seeks to include non-humans in political life. Scholars like Jane Bennett and anthropologists Andrew Bauer and Steve Kasiba, among others, have taken an expansive post-humanist approach to John Dewey's formulation of publics. Like Professor Descola, these scholars are rethinking how we understand and act upon the relations between humans and non-humans in response to emerging concerns about the Anthropocene. Dewey's original intervention was to redefine the public as a political category, changing it from a stable category that an individual, a human person, might belong to, into a group of people that coalesce around a problem or a matter of concern. Bennett and others have drawn upon this framework to imagine publics that are not limited to the human, but that encompass non-humans like omega-3 fatty acids, water reservoirs, historical monuments, and herds of goats. This approach recasts political life as emergent from the constitution of many overlapping and shifting publics, contingent and temporary formations that emerge, act, and leave residues that shape other emergences. In contrast, I understand the collectives that Professor Descola is describing for us as more stable forms, that the acknowledged diversity of social life that is the bread and butter of anthropology is actually overlaid on top of a more fundamental and cohesive structure from these modes of identification. I take the sense of stability and regularity seriously, given its resonances with the debates about structure and agency that have shaped social theory and anthropology across the 20th century and beyond. So the question of how we are to understand social life as ever-changing flux or as deep structure is not only relevant, I think, to Professor Descola's proposal to rethink the project of anthropology, but I think it also has bearing on the specific examples of action in the world that he described at the end of the lecture, these projects that seek to claim juridical rights and status for collectives of humans and non-humans. It seems to me useful to consider how modes of identification might shape how publics could be constituted around problems or matters of concerns, as well as how the relations between different members of a collective are understood and actively addressed or maintained by their human members. This, I think, would allow us to consider what role non-humans play in defining and addressing the matters of concern that publics can emerge around. This approach to political relations centers different questions and concerns than those grounded either in the logics of representation or of kind of a typical juridical personality. And I think these are the ways in which what Professor Descola has provided for us tonight point to new possibilities for world building. I think it also might provide analytical purchase on when and how collectives are transformed, and whether those transformations are linked to shifts between different modes of identification. We must consider the possibility of shifts between or within these three extra-modern modes. So many of Professor Descola's examples for tonight came to us from the Andes. And in a forthcoming book titled Metaphysical Revolutions in the Ancient Andes, Darrell Wilkinson examines a transformation that took place 3,000 years ago, one that he argues altered the ontological filters that shaped social and political life in the Andes. Wilkinson argues that collectives of humans and non-humans shifted from being constituted through what he calls a predatory metaphysics, based on involuntary appropriation, to a reciprocal one. He traces a radical historical change in the forms of association between beings of all kinds, while trying to reject any teleological trajectory that could be reduced to modernist narratives of rationality or social evolution. So this leads me to a question. Professor Descola presents the emergence of the naturalist mode of identification as a process of historical transformation in the West. He describes the overthrow of the organic order of the Ancien Regime as a radical purge of non-humans that left humans as the sole subjects of the law. This radical transformation was cloaked and obscured when anthropologists and other social scientists sought to use terms like society, economy, politics, and religion to understand other societies, mistaking the tools of an active and partisan process of purging the non-human within the West as a stable universal ruler that could be used to measure the other. So elsewhere, Professor Descola indicates that the ontological nature of his typology is not a thesis about what the world is or what it should be, but an inquiry into the ways in which humans perceive and act upon the world and act with the worlds that they live in. But I think this insistence, as important as it is, rubs up against a long history and a deeply rooted intellectual genealogy of narratives about modernity and the West, narratives that marry a historical narrative of rupture, especially between humans and nature, with analytical categories that are then used to analyze human societies within and outside of modernity. For instance, David Graeber and David Wengrow, myself and others, have argued in various ways that the analytical category of inequality and the search for its prehistoric origins has deformed the study of political life in the past. This concern with inequality emerged from modern Western meta-narratives about political order and legitimacy, and in turn enshrines a teleological narrative about plant and animal domestication and the removal of the human from nature. This meta-narrative durably links the increasing control over and separation from nature to the development of structures of hierarchy and exploitation, cast as prototypes of modern inequality and injustice. So not only have archaeologists argued that this meta-narrative struggles to account for the accumulating archaeological evidence, but they argue that it limits our political imagination in the present by naturalizing the features of this meta-narrative. So my question is to ask Professor Descola what connection he sees between the conceptual categories he is discussing for us and this historical narrative of the emergence of naturalism. Does this framework destabilize the relationship between modernity and its past? Or is its intent to reconsider what precisely the rupture of modernity is in order to provide a different history of our current moment and a different vision for our future? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. So I think we have time for a couple of questions, if you'll agree to.
Yes, indeed.
There's a microphone here, so raise your hand if you have a question.
Can I say a few words to thank you first for your very perceptive comments and you raised a number of questions, too many questions for me to be able to answer in the short time we still have. And but I would like to emphasize one or two points. I would like to emphasize that modes of identification are not description of empirical realities. They are models. They are models. I am the one in a long line, which is still fertile in France, of people who have been influenced by Claude Lévi-Strauss and by structuralism. And so what I presented as the modes of identifications are models that I use, and I should think that it is the only way they should be used, as possibilities to understand forms of compatibilities and incompatibilities between institutions, cultural and social elements, etc., etc. They do not describe, by contrast with what David Graeber and David Wengrow did in their book, which I greatly admire. I knew Graeber. I invited him at the Collège de France, in fact, before his death, of course, and I've been and I've known David Wengrow for a long time. We still discuss a lot. By contrast with what they attempted to do in their book, which is to describe different paths or possibilities that escape from the traditional evolutionary model according to which we see the development of humanity as presented by has been the model for archaeologists for a long time, as a sort of continuous progress in the control of nature by technique and a complexification of social organization. They saw that how there were many possibilities to escape from this monolithic account, and forms of what one called regress from progress. That is, in fact, the possibility also, which is very striking and interesting, of abandoning highly centralized and politically centralized polities in order to build other form of politics that were more egalitarians and things like that. So it's a very interesting attempt, but it's very different from what I've attempted to do, which is to provide models in order to try to understand how the chaos of the world can be, and of the ways of world and can be organized. I would have many, many things to say to you and answer to what you said, but I think I'll limit myself to this right now.
Yes. Thank you so much. You want to give some
Good evening, and good evening. Thank you for the talk. I'll try to ask you a question. Sorry, but I'm tired. Oh, yeah, but my English is not very good this evening. So, so the idea about what the collectives, human and non-humans collectives, like the rivers and the people in New Zealand you were talking about. Mine is a very cosmopolitical question. Is that it's the idea that these collectives are affected not only by people or politics around that particular territory, but also, and that's the problem of Anthropocene, they are affected by what we do here right now. For example, if I take too many planes, I don't know, to go to Europe and then come back to the United States, I'm polluting, and so I am creating a problem to this collective. So the idea that they have acquired a political right there in New Zealand is challenged by what for example, my friend Patrice Maniglier has framed in the expression empiètement, that is having the feet on that territory. So we have the feet on that territory, even if we're here in the United States, because of our mode of life, our modes of life. So how do you think that we could face that? For example, I don't know, one of the ideas would be universal citizenship for these kind of collectives. And how do you think that could work?
Yes, it's a difficult question. Um, the I deferred the answering to the invitation here in Colombia because I didn't want to go to cross the Atlantic just for one occasion, and I waited for another invitation that I received from Brown University to combine the two. So I'm very much aware of the weight that we in the modern world, in the global north, exercise on the condition of the planet. I think it's one thing which is important, of course, is granting rights, especially these kinds of rights, which are interesting in the sense that, and in fact, what was interesting in the New Zealand case, in the Sarayaku case, which I mentioned, which didn't, which went without any result, and in other cases like the Rio Trato and the Magpie in Quebec, is that they were initiated by local population, autochthonous populations that were fighting for their rights in a way which they wanted to be original. That is, they wanted to escape from the classical question of autochthony. And it's interesting in the case of Sarayaku, for historical reasons, this community, this Quechua-speaking community, is the product of an ethnogenesis that was brought about by the reducciones, that is, these small islands of missionary control in Amazonia, which protected the Amerindians from the slave raiders from the Spaniards. And these people acquired a sort of mixed identity. They lost their initial language and learned Quechua, which was the language of evangelization by the missionaries. And so they clearly understood that the notion of autochthony, that our ancestors have lived here ever since the beginning of time, doesn't work, because it's not true. There's been a lot of movement in this whole area. And so the idea of claiming the protection of a territory, not on autochthony, but on the fact that it is a support for a sort of relation which is original. In fact, it's not not original, because it's classical in all the area. Anne-Christine Taylor and I have been working with the Achua just south of Sarayaku, and they have the same cosmology, etc. So the same argument could be used for the protection of the whole of autochthonous Amazonia. But I think one answer is granting rights, and the other aspect is making known the situation of these people and the effect of our greediness. When I mean our, not necessarily each one of us, but the capitalist system within which we deploy our life. So this is why I mentioned Anthropocene in the title, but I prefer the word capitalocene, because it's a system that has been destroying the condition of the functioning of the system of the earth, not the anthropos as such. So making the process known and to everyone, and so through all forms of knowledge available and the diffusion of knowledge available everywhere, so that we cannot claim ignorance as to what are the consequences of our acts within this capitalist system, because we participate in it. And so what are the consequences of our acts? And there's a growing awareness among younger people in particular of these consequences, but not enough. So we should go and preach, as I'm doing tonight, everywhere, to raise the awareness of the consequences of our actions on not only the devastation of the world, but the devastation of some parts of the world, which, in particular in Amazonia. Amazonia, as you perhaps know, is the Amazonian forest is an anthropogenic forest. I won't enter into the details, but it's something that ethnobotanists and archaeologists have shown. So the floristic composition of the forest is the result of millennia of manipulation of the forest. So it's not only the destruction of wild nature, it's not the destruction of the green resource of the earth. It's a destruction of a very complex and intricate landscape that has been built over generations by autochthonous populations. And this destruction is akin to destroying any landscape that had been anthropized anywhere else. So these kinds of arguments should be used again and again to try to render people conscious of what they are doing and their responsibility in the state of the world.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was a really fascinating presentation, very encompassing as well of your whole work as well. I was wondering, I was very intrigued by the role that you give to rights and to law generally. You gave some very eloquent examples of the way in which the use of the law can help prevent the destruction of ecosystems. I was wondering whether, if the goal is, if I understood correctly, is if the goal is to transform our ontology or Western ontology, whether rights is the correct way to do that or the most efficient way to do that. And the reason I'm asking the question is I'm wondering whether rights are not another way of exercising power over the natural world in our own Western naturalistic conception of the world, and whether by using rights we're not also relying on the implementation of these rights, which depend on another form of authority, which is a third party which is supposed to be neutral, and as we've seen with judges around the world, they're very often not. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yes. Initially, as many young men, when I was a young man of my generation, I tended to see the language of rights and law as a sort of codification of the domination of the ruling classes, which was a very naive way of looking at right and law. And by exchanging with colleagues in or specialists in law, I came to understand that the rights are flexible, and that law is flexible and can be adapted to different circumstances. And so I don't see what I presented as the giving rights to milieu or forms of or ecosystems as an ultimate answer to the predicament we are in, but as a step, and an interesting step in the sense that it's happening now, and that in contexts that are different in the sense that their legal system is very different. The legal system of New Zealand and the legal system of Colombia are two completely different legal systems. One is common law, the other one is inspired by Napoleonic law. It's also, but in both cases, there's a possibility for a milieu to exercise its rights. And I find this interesting in the sense of cosmopolitics precisely. In the origin of the term with Kant is the idea of the duty of hospitality, universal hospitality, as a form of building perpetual peace and having a universal legal system that allows perpetual peace. But this notion of hospitality, I find it in the fact that an ecosystem becomes hospitable for humans. And it reverses the sense of appropriation. No, it's not humans appropriating an element of the world. It's an element of the world, the earth, if you wish, if you want to use the earth with the capital E, that becomes hospitable for humans, and humans have to recognize this hospitality, which is not the case, of course. Now, the basis of naturalism is that when you transform non-humans into commodities, you disregard what are non-humans and all of the responsibilities that you have in the care of these non-humans, which is an exceptional moment in humanity. There's no other case like that in the history of humanity, where a social system, let's say, has considered that it had no responsibility towards non-humans. So insisting on the idea that since the Earth or a specific ecosystem gives us hospitality, we have a debt towards. It's not only the debt of using it, transforming it into a commodities, but it's a debt towards the general milieu where we develop our lives. So this is, I think, an interesting reason. There are many other things that I could say. I'm in a country like France with a highly centralized system. The idea that an ecosystem could receive a legal representation appears to be still very far, although I've participated into discussions about the Loire, no? And the idea of a parliament of the Loire. And there are attempts elsewhere. But I've also participated with, not long ago, in the National Assembly, and in a few weeks at the Senate, in discussions that have been partly triggered by people like me and partly triggered by representatives, no? That is, deputies in the parliament and senators, about the way that some of the relation to territory could be changed. And so for in France, there's a disposition that is not very well known, which are called in French the sections de commune. They are parts of the commune is the smallest administrative circumscription, and sections de commune are rights that people have inherited within a commune to use as a common woods, for instance, or pastures. These are very common in mountainous regions in France. And it exists, it's tolerated by law, not really recognized, it's tolerated. And the idea, of course, is that it implies a completely different relationship to this part, which is still a part of the territory of the commune, which is still considered as a resource, no? But still a resource in common for which the members who have inherited this possibility to deal with it have a responsibility to care for. So there are elements like that which I find interesting. I mentioned the ZAD, but the ZAD is I was fascinated by the ZAD, the Zone à Défendre, this collective that was where appeared, emerged to defend territories that were submitted to a major project, in the case of Notre-Dame-des-Landes, an airport. And these alternative collectives are formed by people who have decided to live a very different life on these territories by cultivating, raising animals, etc., and sharing everything. And of course, the idea is to create a sort of ideal commune with a very important element, which is the deep identification with the place and its non-human inhabitants, which I found absolutely striking. No, which exists, of course, in any rural setting, but in this case was developed by these people who were mainly coming from urban squats. So they had no previous experience of this part of France, which is called the bocage, which is a very specific organization of the rural space. And in a few years, they built a deep identification with the place, which means it's not something that needs to be transmitted from generation to generation in the Amazonian rainforest. No? It can also appear in specific circumstances where people feel a responsibility towards first the defense and the protection of an environment, and then develop these deep feelings towards this place.
Well, I'm afraid that we've run out of time. We could talk for much longer, but thank you so much for a rich and stimulating conversation.